July 18, 1959. Mayme Johnson, Bumpy's wife, was shopping at a grocery store on Lenox Avenue at 2:30 in the afternoon. She was selecting produce when a dispute erupted at the counter. A Italian capo named Salvatore "Sally" Burns Granello was arguing loudly with the store owner, a Korean immigrant named Mr. Kim, over protection payments. Sally Burns ran a crew for the Genovese family and had been trying to expand his protection racket into parts of Harlem. Mr. Kim had been resisting, explaining he already paid Bumpy's organization for protection and couldn't afford to pay twice. Sally Burns was drunk and angry. His voice echoed through the small store. "I don't care who you pay. You're in New York. That means you pay the commission. You pay me starting today or I burn this place down." Mayme, who'd been quietly shopping, walked over to the counter. Her voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Kim already has protection. He doesn't need yours. Leave him alone." Sally Burns turned and saw Mayme for the first time. He didn't recognize her, just saw a black woman interfering in his business. "Who the hell are you? Mind your business before you get hurt." Mayme looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm Mayme Johnson, Bumpy Johnson's wife, and this store is under our protection. You need to leave, now." What happened next shocked everyone in the store. Sally Burns, enraged at being challenged by a woman, stepped forward and slapped Mayme across the face. Hard. The sound echoed through the store. Mayme stumbled back, her cheek reddening. Sally Burns pointed at her. "That's what happens when you disrespect me. Now get out before I do worse." Mayme steadied herself, touched her face, and spoke quietly. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Then she walked out of the store. Within 6 hours, Bumpy Johnson knew what had happened. Within 24 hours, Sally Burns understood the consequences. Within 1 week, Sally Burns and his entire immediate family had fled New York and would never return. What Bumpy did to Sally Burns wasn't violence. It was something far more devastating. Systematic destruction that left Sally alive but ruined, exiled, and serving as a permanent warning about what happened when you touched Bumpy Johnson's family. To understand why Sally Burns's slap was such a catastrophic error and why Bumpy's response was so devastating, you need to understand several things. First, who Sally Burns was. Second, the absolute sanctity Bumpy placed on family. And third, the specific method Bumpy chose for retaliation. Salvatore Granello had earned his nickname, Sally Burns, because of his preferred intimidation method. He'd burn businesses that refused protection payments, starting with small fires as warnings and escalating to total destruction. He was 42 years old in 1959, a capo in the Genovese family with about 20 soldiers under his command. Sally Burns was competent, but not particularly intelligent. He'd risen through the ranks by being willing to do violent work and by having a complete lack of conscience about hurting civilians. By July 1959, he'd been trying to expand his protection racket from Little Italy into the southern edges of Harlem for about 6 months. He'd had limited success because most businesses in those areas already paid Bumpy's organization and had no reason to switch. Sally Burns had been getting frustrated with this resistance and had been drinking more heavily, which made him more volatile. On July 18th, he'd been drinking since noon before going to Mr. Kim's store to collect what he viewed as owed protection money. He was drunk, angry, and looking for someone to intimidate. Mayme Johnson was 53 years old in 1959. She'd been married to Bumpy for about 10 years, though they'd known each other much longer. She was educated, articulate, and deeply involved in Harlem's community. She wasn't involved in Bumpy's criminal activities directly, but she understood that world and her position in it. Mayme was also principled and unafraid. When she saw Sally Burns intimidating Mr. Kim, she intervened not because Bumpy would want her to, but because it was the right thing to do. She knew who she was, Bumpy Johnson's wife. That identity carried weight in Harlem. Sally Burns should have recognized the name and backed off immediately, but he was too drunk and too angry to process what she'd said, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Either way, when he slapped Mayme, he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. When news reached Bumpy at approximately 3:15 p.m., he was in a meeting at Small's Paradise discussing completely unrelated business. Illinois Gordon pulled him aside and whispered what had happened. The description of Bumpy's reaction varied depending on who told the story later, but everyone agreed on the basics. Bumpy went completely still. His expression didn't change. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood up, told everyone the meeting was over, and walked out. Illinois followed him. "Boss, what do you want to do?" Bumpy's voice was quiet and cold. "Find out everything about Sally Burns. Family, finances, properties, debts, connections, fears, secrets, everything. I want a complete profile within 6 hours." Illinois understood. This wasn't going to be a quick retaliation. This was going to be systematic destruction. Over the next 6 hours, Bumpy's intelligence network went to work. They gathered information from dozens of sources. By 9:00 p.m., Bumpy had a thick file on Salvatore Granello. The file contained devastating information. Sally Burns had been skimming from his protection collections, keeping money that should have gone to the Genovese family. He'd been doing this for over a year, accumulating about $40,000 he'd hidden from his bosses. Sally Burns had a mistress in Queens named Angela, who he'd set up in an apartment using money from his skimming. His wife Maria knew about the affair and was deeply unhappy, but stayed because of their 3 children. Sally Burns's younger brother Tony was involved in minor criminal activities, but wasn't a made member of any family. Tony had debts to several loan sharks and was vulnerable to pressure. Sally Burns himself owed money to a Genovese loan operation for gambling debts, about $15,000 that he'd been paying back slowly. Sally Burns's oldest daughter was engaged to marry a legitimate businessman who didn't know about his future father-in-law's criminal activities. The wedding was scheduled for September. All of this information gave Bumpy multiple pressure points. But Bumpy's strategy wasn't to kill Sally Burns or even hurt him physically. It was to destroy his life so completely that death would have been mercy. July 19th, morning. Bumpy sent word to Sally Burns through intermediaries. The message was simple. "You slapped my wife yesterday. You have 24 hours to leave New York permanently with your immediate family. If you're still in the city after that deadline, I will destroy everything you have and everyone you love." Sally Burns, sober now and realizing the magnitude of his mistake, panicked. He tried to get protection from the Genovese family. He went to his capo and explained the situation, asking for family backing against Bumpy's threat. This was his second catastrophic mistake. Because when the Genovese family leadership heard that Sally Burns had assaulted Bumpy Johnson's wife, their reaction wasn't to protect Sally. It was to distance themselves from him immediately. Vito Genovese himself sent word to Bumpy through back channels. The Genovese family does not condone what Sally Burns did. He acted independently and stupidly. We will not protect him from consequences. Handle this however you see fit. This message meant Sally Burns was on his own. No family backing. No protection. Isolated. When Sally Burns learned that his own family had abandoned him, he tried to negotiate directly with Bumpy. He sent intermediaries offering apologies, offering money, offering to leave his Harlem operations, offering anything to make this go away. Bumpy's response was delivered through Illinois Gordon. It's too late for negotiation. The deadline stands. 24 hours to leave New York permanently or face total destruction. Sally Burns made his third catastrophic mistake. He decided to stay and tough it out. He thought Bumpy was bluffing, thought that without Genovese backing, but also without them actively helping Bumpy, he could survive through his own resources and connections. He was catastrophically wrong. July 20th, the deadline passed with Sally Burns still in New York. Bumpy began his systematic destruction campaign. Phase 1, financial destruction. Bumpy sent information about Sally Burns's skimming to Vito Genovese through trusted channels, backed by documentation that proved Sally had stolen $40,000 from family collections. The Genovese family's response was immediate. They froze Sally Burns's operations, seized his territory, and demanded immediate repayment of the $40,000 plus 50% penalty. Sally Burns didn't have $60,000. He'd hidden the $40,000 he'd skimmed, but accessing it now would prove he'd been stealing. He was trapped. Phase 2. Personal destruction. Bumpy sent anonymous information to Sally Burns's wife, Maria, about the full extent of his affair with Angela, including photos and details about the apartment Sally had set up for his mistress. Maria, who'd tolerated her knowledge of the affair because it was relatively discreet, was humiliated by the detailed exposure. She filed for separation and took their 3 children to her mother's house in New Jersey. Phase 3, family pressure. Bumpy's people approached Sally Burns's brother Tony and offered to pay off his loan shark debts, about $8,000, in exchange for Tony's public statement that his brother had brought shame to their family. Tony, desperate and seeing no loyalty from Sally, accepted. He made a statement to various neighborhood people that Sally Burns was a disgrace who attacked women and had destroyed their family's honor. Phase 4. Future destruction. Bumpy sent anonymous but detailed information about Sally Burns's criminal activities to the legitimate businessman engaged to Sally's daughter. This included evidence of murders, arson, extortion. The businessman, horrified, broke off the engagement immediately. Sally's daughter was devastated. Phase 5. Operational destruction. Bumpy used his connections with police to feed them information about Sally Burns's criminal activities. Not enough to guarantee arrest, but enough to make Sally's operations impossible to conduct. Every time Sally tried to collect protection money, police would show up. Every time he tried to meet with associates, surveillance would appear. His business became impossible. Phase 6. Physical pressure without violence. Bumpy had his people follow Sally Burns everywhere, not threatening him, not touching him, just following. making it clear he was being watched every moment. Sally couldn't eat in a restaurant without seeing Bumpy's people at a nearby table, couldn't walk down a street without noticing someone trailing him. This constant surveillance was psychologically devastating. Phase 7. Reputation destruction. Bumpy spread word throughout New York's organized crime community about what Sally Burns had done. Not the slap itself necessarily, but Sally's response. How he'd tried to get family protection for an action everyone agreed was indefensible. How he'd stayed in New York despite being told to leave. How he was now facing consequences and crying about it. Sally Burns became a joke, someone who'd made a stupid mistake and then handled it in the worst possible way. By July 27th, 9 days after the slap, Sally Burns's life was completely destroyed. He'd lost his position in the Genovese family. He owed them $60,000 he couldn't pay. His wife had left him and taken the children. His brother had publicly disowned him. His daughter's engagement had been broken off. Police were making his operations impossible. He was being followed constantly, and everyone in New York's underworld was laughing at him. Sally Burns finally broke. On July 28th, he approached one of Bumpy's intermediaries and begged for mercy. "I'll leave. I'll go wherever you want. Just stop destroying my family. They didn't do anything wrong." Bumpy's response was delivered through Illinois. "You should have thought about your family before you slapped my wife. You should have left when you were told to leave. But because your daughter and your wife genuinely are innocent victims of your stupidity, I'm willing to offer terms." Sally Burns grabbed at this lifeline. Anything. What are the terms? The terms were brutal but clear. Sally Burns had to leave New York within 48 hours and never return. He had to settle his debt with the Genovese family by giving them everything he owned. Property, savings, everything. He had to publicly apologize to Mayme Johnson in front of witnesses from multiple organizations. He had to sign a statement admitting what he'd done and acknowledging that the consequences were just. He had to agree that if he or any member of his immediate family ever returned to New York, they would be killed on sight. No warnings, no second chances. Sally Burns accepted every term. On July 29th, he appeared at a meeting arranged by Bumpy at a neutral location. Present were representatives from the Genovese family, other commission families, and Harlem organizations. Sally Burns stood before this assembly and read a prepared statement. On July 18th, 1959, I assaulted Mayme Johnson without provocation. This was a cowardly act against an innocent woman. I disrespected Bumpy Johnson and the entire Harlem community. I deserve every consequence I have received. I am leaving New York permanently and will never return. I apologize to Mrs. Johnson, to Mr. Johnson, and to everyone who witnessed my disgrace." The room was silent. Sally Burns looked at Mayme, who was sitting next to Bumpy. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm sorry for what I did. There's no excuse. I'm sorry." Mayme's response was dignified. "I accept your apology. Now leave and never come back." Sally Burns signed documents transferring all his assets to the Genovese family to settle his debt. He signed a statement acknowledging the permanent exile terms. Then he left. Within 2 days, Sally Burns and his immediate family had left New York. They moved to a small town in Pennsylvania where Sally worked construction under a different name. He never returned to New York. Not even for his mother's funeral in 1964. He remained in exile until his death in 1978. But the story didn't end with Sally Burns's exile. the consequences reverberated throughout organized crime in New York. First, it reinforced that Bumpy Johnson's family was absolutely off-limits. Even accidental or drunken offenses would be punished with total destruction. Everyone got the message. Second, it demonstrated that Bumpy's intelligence network was sophisticated enough to gather comprehensive information quickly and use it strategically. Sally Burns's life had been destroyed in 9 days using information most people didn't know existed. This made everyone more cautious about what vulnerabilities they might have that Bumpy could exploit. Third, it showed that Bumpy's preferred method of retaliation was systematic destruction rather than simple violence. Death would have been quick. Exile after complete destruction was permanent suffering. This approach was more terrifying than murder. Fourth, it proved that the Commission wouldn't protect made members who violated certain boundaries. The Genovese family's abandonment of Sally Burns sent a message that assaulting women, especially women connected to respected operators, was beyond the pale. When Illinois Gordon asked Bumpy why he'd chosen exile and destruction rather than simply killing Sally Burns, Bumpy's answer was instructive. Killing him would have been a message that lasted a week. What I did to him is a message that will last decades. Every time someone thinks about disrespecting my family or my community, they'll remember Sally Burns, how his life was destroyed, how his family suffered, how he ended up in exile working construction in Pennsylvania. That memory is more powerful than fear of death. Mayme Johnson herself rarely spoke publicly about the incident. But in an interview decades later, she was asked how she felt about Bumpy's response. Her answer was complex. Part of me wished he'd just let it go. Sally Burns was drunk and stupid. Did his entire life need to be destroyed over one slap? But another part of me understood that it wasn't just about me. It was about principle. If Bumpy had let this pass, it would have signaled that his family could be touched. That would have put our daughters at risk. Every criminal in New York would have seen weakness. So while I felt sympathy for Sally Burns's innocent family members, I understood why Bumpy did what he did. And I'd be lying if I said there wasn't satisfaction in watching a man who'd hurt me face real consequences. The grocery store owner, Mr. Kim, remained a loyal supporter of Bumpy's for the rest of Bumpy's life. The store became a kind of informal museum piece where older Harlem residents would point out to younger people, "That's where Sally Burns made his mistake. That's where it all started." The story became legend in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson's wife got slapped by a mobster. Within a week, the mobster's life was destroyed, and he fled the city forever. Never came back, died in exile. That's what happens when you disrespect Bumpy's family. The Sally Burns incident was referenced in FBI files as evidence of Bumpy's sophistication and reach. A report from 1960 noted, "Subject Johnson's response to the assault on his wife demonstrates capacity for complex multi-phase operations involving intelligence gathering, strategic pressure application, and coordination with multiple criminal organizations." Subject's preferred method of retaliation appears to be systematic life destruction rather than violence, making traditional law enforcement protection strategies ineffective. The Genovese family's abandonment of Sally Burns created some internal tensions. Some members felt the family should have protected a made member regardless of what he'd done. Others argued that Sally's actions were so stupid and indefensible that he deserved no protection. This debate continued for years, but ultimately the precedent stood. Certain actions put you beyond family protection. Assaulting the wife of a respected independent operator was one of those actions. Sally Burns's brother Tony, who'd publicly disowned Sally, eventually moved to California and lived a legitimate life. He told people he'd had a brother who'd been involved in organized crime, but they'd had a falling out. He never explained the details. Sally Burns's wife, Maria, eventually remarried and lived a quiet life in New Jersey. She maintained that her ex-husband had been a troubled man who'd made terrible decisions and that she and her children were victims of those decisions. She was largely correct. Sally Burns's daughter, whose engagement had been broken off, eventually married someone else and lived a normal life. But she never spoke to her father again after the incident. She blamed him for destroying her first engagement and embarrassing the family. Sally Burns himself lived out his remaining 19 years in Pennsylvania. He worked construction, drank too much, and died of liver failure in 1978 at age 61. Local obituaries identified him as a construction worker who'd moved from New York. They didn't mention his past. A few old mobsters who knew the story attended his funeral out of morbid curiosity. One of them reported back that it was a small, sad affair. Maybe 20 people. No one from New York. Just local acquaintances who knew him as a quiet, troubled man who drank too much and never talked about his past. The contrast to Bumpy Johnson's funeral in 1968, attended by thousands, was stark. The July 18th incident and its aftermath demonstrated several of Bumpy's core principles. First, family is sacred. Threats to family are met with overwhelming response. Second, intelligence is power. Having comprehensive information about opponents allows for precise, devastating pressure. Third, systematic destruction is more effective than violence. Death ends suffering. Exile and ruination create permanent consequences and lessons. Fourth, reputation matters. Sally Burns's reputation was destroyed as completely as his life, ensuring the lesson reached everyone. The incident also showed the limits of organizational protection. Sally Burns was a made member of a powerful family, but his actions were so indefensible that his family abandoned him. This demonstrated that certain moral boundaries existed even in organized crime. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, Sally Burns was still alive in Pennsylvania. But he didn't attend the funeral, didn't send condolences, didn't acknowledge Bumpy's death in any way. He spent his remaining 10 years trying to forget that Bumpy Johnson had ever existed. But he never succeeded. The memory of those 9 days in July 1959 haunted him until his death. If you made it to the end of this story, you understand why touching Bumpy Johnson's family was the most catastrophic mistake Sally Burns ever made. Hit that like button if this story showed you that some violations have consequences beyond violence. Drop a comment and tell me, was Bumpy's response justified or excessive? Where's the line between protection and revenge? And subscribe because next time we're exploring how Bumpy Johnson built a shadow welfare system in Harlem that provided food, rent assistance, and job opportunities to struggling families, demonstrating that his influence was about more than just crime. You won't want to miss that. Remember what happened on July 18, 1959. Sally Burns, drunk and angry, slapped Mayme Johnson in a grocery store. Within 6 hours, Bumpy knew. Within 9 days, Sally's life was completely destroyed. He lost his position, his family, his money, his reputation, everything. He was exiled from New York permanently and died in Pennsylvania 19 years later, never having returned even once. Bumpy didn't kill him. Death would have been mercy. Instead, Bumpy destroyed Sally's life so thoroughly that he became a permanent warning. Touch Bumpy's family and you don't die quick. You lose everything and live with the consequences. That's not just revenge. That's sending a message that echoes through decades. Sally Burns made one mistake in a moment of drunken anger. That mistake cost him everything, and it ensured that for the next 9 years until Bumpy's death, no one ever touched, threatened, or disrespected anyone in Bumpy Johnson's family. Because they all remembered Sally Burns. And they all understood that some violations have consequences worse than death.